and KETC, the St. Louis Educational Television, present a course for television. Of Man, with Dr. Houston Smith, Associate Professor of Philosophy at Washington University.
Tonight, as we move into Christianity, the last of the religions which we shall be considering in this series, I want to begin with a letter which I received back when this course was first announced. This is the way it reads. After expressing great enthusiasm for the possibility of such a course, it continues as follows. I am also writing to hope that when you come to teach about Christianity, the Christianity you present will not appear to be just one more of the comparative religions. Comparative religions is a great study, but never forget, Christianity is not one of them. Well, this, I think, states very nicely the problem for these last three discussions. Thus far, I've been talking about material which, with the exception of Judaism, has been for the most part unfamiliar and also has been material with which you have not been involved personally. But with Christianity, of course, all this becomes changed. All of you know a great deal about this religion. Just a glance at the map and see how much the words, the names of the places, have woven themselves into the very fabric of our collective life. Bethlehem, Nazareth, Jerusalem. Some of you, by virtue either of more years or of more concentration upon this religion, know a great deal more about it than I do. And most of you have deep feelings about the subject and its material, about the nature of Christ, the nature of the church, about eternity and the destiny of man in relation to eternity. Well, I needn't pretend that I am aloof. I have feelings about this material, of course, myself. Insofar as possible, I'm going to try to keep my personal feelings out of this material just as much as possible. And yet I realize very well, of course, that complete objectivity in matters as personal as these, complete objectivity is a myth. And though I try to do my best to keep my particular point of view out of the picture, it's bound to come through at times. And when it does, well, all I can do is to rely on your maturity, first to detect it, and second, to discount it, or in any event, to try to keep it from standing in the way of the material itself. Now, Christianity. Christianity isn't merely an ideology. It's a historical religion. It's not founded only on truths. It's founded on facts as well. It's not founded only on principles, it's founded on concrete events. The central fact, of course, on which Christianity builds is Jesus, who is called the Christ, which means literally the anointed. This then, obviously, is where any study of Christianity has to begin. Now, when we turn to Christ and ask who he was, the answer of the church, as we all know, is a double one. He was God, and he was also man. Everything in the Christian view of Christ depends on holding these two aspects together. And yet, our minds are human, and we have to think of one thing at a time. And so, purely for purposes of procedure, tonight we're going to concentrate on the human aspect of Christ, and then next time move on to questions centering around his divinity and the idea of the atonement. Now, when we do move to look at Christ in his human aspect, we are immediately struck and somewhat dismayed by the lack of concrete information. We don't even know what he looked like. Carlyle once said that though he was a poor man, he would gladly give a third of everything he had just to have an accurate representation of what Jesus looked like. I'm sure there are people who would give more than a third of what they have. Unfortunately, the wish must remain unfulfilled. It is impossible, much as millions have longed to do so, to have a helicopter view of the man in which we could transcend the centuries and come down in his midst. This particular representation of Christ, which we have here, we selected primarily because of its antiquity. We wanted to get as close back to the original as we could, and this one goes back about 1,500 years. But you will notice how strange it looks in comparison with many other representations. People tend to see Christ in various ways, to picture him in various ways. There is the gentle Jesus, meek and mild, who adorns the nursery room walls, surrounded by children and lambs. And then there is the Jesus whom one of my professors said he liked to imagine as a rugged prophet with a red beard swinging over the hills of Galilee towards Jerusalem. Everybody imagines Jesus after his own imaginations. In China, where I grew up, he was conceived more often as not as an Oriental with that cast of features. When we turn from the physical representations to the facts of his life, again, the solid biographical facts are surprisingly few. We know that he was born in Palestine under Herod the Great. We know that he was brought up in Nazareth and probably lived the normal life of a Jew of his period. We know that he taught, there's some debate whether it was around 1 year or 3 years, but between 1 and 3 years, mostly in the area of Galilee, that he incurred the hostility of some of his own compatriots and the suspicion of Rome, and that in the end he was crucified near Jerusalem, on the outskirts of Jerusalem. Now, as far as the facts, the straight objective facts about the human aspect of Jesus are concerned, that's about it. Fortunately, however, when we turn to the deeper questions, what kind of a man was he? What was the quality of the life which he lived? When we turn to these questions, the picture comes into focus with really astonishing clarity. The point, to come to the point at once, is that those who were closest to him, those who lived in intimate contact with him from day to day, by virtue of what they saw and what they heard, were driven in the end to the absolute conviction that this man was God. Christ has been exalted through the centuries since his time, but there's one point which is very important to keep in mind, and that is that no subsequent generation has exalted him more than did his own, the generation of Peter and Paul and James Now, what was it about this man which elicited from those who knew him best this ultimate evaluation, the conviction that he was God? Well, I think we can say that three things pressured them to this conclusion: what he did, what he said, and what he was. Let's begin first with what he did. The gospel accounts are full of the glory of Christ, of his mighty deeds, of his wondrous works. Miracles abound in the records, and there's no question but these impress the people very much. And yet I think we make a mistake if we put our emphasis there. For one thing, that certainly wasn't where Christ put his emphasis. For another thing, the scholars have found that parallel accounts of similar miracles abound in the literature of the time. Whether we think those other accounts were true or not, there's no question but the people thought they were true. But the fact of people performing this kind of deed didn't cause the people who were in the presence of these wonders to thereby conclude that those who did them were therefore divine. And so I think we have to take a different emphasis. I think we get closer to Christ through what he did if we look not so much at the wonders as to Peter's own summary. What did Jesus do? Well, on one occasion, Peter found himself addressing a throng, and it was necessary for him to say in very short compass, to summarize the works of Jesus' life. And he did it in 5 words. What did Jesus do? He went about doing good. What a simple epitaph. And yet, what could be more sublime? Healing, helping the people out of their jams, counseling them in the crises of their lives. He went about doing good. He went about doing good with such consistency and singleness of mind, in fact, that the people who were with him from day to day found their thinking flipped over into this new category. They found themselves thinking, if God be pure goodness, then this is the way he would act if he were in human form. But it wasn't only what Jesus did, but what he said, which made his contemporaries think of him in new dimensions. There's been a lot of controversy, of course, as to the originality of Jesus' thinking. For my money, the most balanced view, perhaps, is that stated by a great Jewish scholar named Klausner in his monumental work, Life of Christ. What Klausner says is that if you take the teachings of Jesus separately, you can find a parallel to every one of them in either the Old Testament or the Apocrypha or the Talmud or the Mishnah or the Gemara. But if you take them as a whole, Klausner is continuing, if you take them as a whole, there is about his teachings an urgency, an ardent, vivid quality, an extravagance and an abandon, and above all, a complete absence of second-rate material, which makes this teaching as a whole refreshingly new. The language of Jesus, as a matter of fact, is a study in itself. This extravagance I've mentioned, the passionate quality of it, has caused one great poet to speak of the language of Jesus as gigantesque. If your hand offends you, Jesus says, cut it off. If your eye stands between you and the best which your life can attain, pluck it out. Jesus is always talking about camels going through the eyes of needles, of people who would strain gnats with fastidiousness out of what they were drinking. Meanwhile, they're swallowing camels. They go around looking for tiny specks in the eyes of their nature with huge beams sticking out of their own eyes. He talks of people who in their outer life it resembles whited sepulchres, but inside they're full of dead men's bones. This isn't just rhetoric, just style. This isn't just ethyl poured in the gasoline for more power and effect. This language belongs to the man himself and stems from the urgency and the passionate quality of his driving convictions. Well, what did he say? We've talked about how he said it, but what did he say? Well, not a great deal as far as our records have it. Everything, if you linked it all together, could be said in 2 hours' time. And yet, these words are the most often repeated words in all the world. Love your neighbor. Whatsoever ye would that men would do unto you, do ye also unto them. Come unto me, all ye who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. Statements like this. But most of the time, he just told stories. Parables, we call them. Of a hidden treasure, of a sower who went out to sow, of a pearl merchant, of the Good Samaritan, of a young man who blew all his inheritance on one binge, of the man who had 2 sons, one who did his will and one who did not. Stories of this kind. One can't really abstract the gist of these stories and try to reduce them to flat propositional form. They lose their power when you do this. People said when they heard Jesus' teachings, "Never spake man thus." But when you reduce it to simply propositional form, then it loses the concrete flavor of it all. And yet we have to go on to try to do that because we want to know what he was driving at. What was it that was urging him throughout all his life? Well, when we try to put it in a capsule, the vision which obsessed him and the idea which dominated all his thinking is epitomized in the phrase, the kingdom of God, or as it is sometimes translated, the kingdom of heaven. There's some people who see things mostly the way they are. But there are other people who see things not so much the way they are as the way they ought to be. And sometimes for this other kind of person, the way things ought to be is seen so vividly, with such intensity that it becomes more important to them than the way things are in a plain realism. And Jesus, without question, was of that second category. For Jesus, the kingdom of God was the way life ought to be lived. It was life in terms of its ultimate possibilities, which ought to be realized here and now. For him, the kingdom of God was the reign of righteousness and peace, which the prophets had foretold. It was the time when God's will would be done on earth as it was done in heaven. A time when peace and freedom would cover the earth as waters, and when justice and love would hold universal sway. It was a time when not only men individually, but even their forms, their institutions, their collective life would be transformed into a new order. It was a time when all men would be brothers under the friendly skies of God. Now, we are told that when people heard the teachings of Jesus about the kingdom of heaven, they were astonished. We lose the force of this today because we've heard his words so often that the freshness have been rubbed off of them by convention and routine. But if we go back to see what Jesus was saying, there's small wonder that the people were astonished, because the teachings of Jesus about the kingdom of heaven propose a standard of values so radically at odds with the way you and I go about our lives here and now that they become almost frightening. Let's look at some of these and see how at odds, really, with the ways of the world these teachings are. We're told that we're not to resist evil by force. We're to turn the other cheek. But we of the world, we assume that evil has to be resisted by force. We're told to love our enemies and to bless them that curse us. But the world assumes that it's good to love our friends only and to hate our enemies. We're told that the sun rises upon the just and the unjust alike. But the world assumes that the sun really ought to rise only on the just, and the unjust ought to get their deserts and ought to have to live under a cloud all the time. We're told that the publicans and the harlots go into heaven before the righteous. But the world assumes that the good, the respectable people, those who fulfill the norm, lead the way into heaven. We're told that narrow is the gate and straight the way that leads to salvation. But we live in a world of conventionality, in which we assume that the way to live is the way everybody else is living, getting on the bandwagon, living a life of conformity with others. We're told that we're to be as carefree as the birds of the air and the lilies of the field. But the world lives on the assumption that we should take infinite care for the moral and build our lives on endless thought and prudence. We're told that it is as difficult for the rich to enter the kingdom of heaven as camels to go through an eye of a needle. But the world esteems the rich above all and honors them as being first. We're told that the happy people are those who are meek and who weep and who are merciful and pure in heart. But the world assumes that the people who are happy are those who are rich and who are powerful and are well-born. There is about these teachings an air of liberty and freedom which frightens the world, and we can barely stand it to look at them straight. In the end, we have to say, either there was something crazy about this man, or with H.G. Wells, that our hearts are still too small for what he was trying to say. Well, we've spoken of what Christ did. We've spoken of what he said. And yet, these alone would not have been enough to pressure the evaluation of his associates, were it not for the fact that they were underlain by a third factor, namely what he was. No one can read what Jesus said about sincerity and humility without sensing that he himself seemed to be free of all deceit and pride. Truth for him was the breath of life, and falsity as suffocating as a tomb. Moreover, he seemed to be a man of surpassing charm and winsomeness, who bore about him, as someone has said, no strangeness at all save the strangeness of perfection. He liked people, and they liked him in turn. In fact, they loved him. Many people did, and they loved him intensely. And to their love, he responded with an equal love. He felt the appeal of other people as such, whether they were rich or poor, old or young, yes, whether they were saints or sinners. He enjoyed children. He defied conventions because he felt that conventions raised these barriers between life and life. And he hated injustice because of what it did to what he called the least of these. And above all else, he hated hypocrisy because it seemed to conceal a man even from himself and to preclude that depth of fellowship which he was trying to build up among men. And so in the end, especially when he laid down his life for his friends, it seemed to those who knew him best that here was a man in whom the human ego, all willfulness of heart, seemed to have disappeared completely. And the life was so completely under the will of God that it had become transparent to him. And so when they felt that when they were looking at Jesus, they were looking at the way God would behave in his form. No wonder then the final lyric cry of triumph from them, we beheld his glory, as of the glory of the only begotten Son of the Father. Our time is up, and tonight we have started with the human aspect of Jesus and tried to watch how this human aspect impelled those around him to modulate their thinking about him up into a different dimension. Next week we shall carry on from this point, and we shall examine more closely his divinity as proclaimed and conceived by the church. There's a passage in Matthew which is a bridge from what we have been saying this evening to our theme for next week. It was towards the close of Jesus' life, just a few weeks before his death, and he had withdrawn with his disciples to a quiet spot in Caesarea Philippi. And the disciples come to him and tell him that people are asking who he is. And Jesus says to them, "Who do they say I am?" And they reply, "Some say John the Baptist, others Elijah, others Jeremiah or one of the prophets." But he said to them, "But who do you say I am?" And Peter answered, "Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God."
The preceding program was distributed by the Educational Television and Radio Center. This is National Educational Television.